welcome back to another video, and in this video we're going to be continuing on with our macOS development with UIKit, or rather not UIKit, AppKit. I'm still in the UIKit mindset. And today, in this particular video, we're going to be taking a look at NSButton, specifically push buttons, using NSButton for AppKit. Now, what is an NSButton? Well, an NSButton is a type of view, which is a subclass of NSView and NSControl in AppKit. And this allows you to create several different kinds of buttons, such as pop-up buttons, radio buttons, checkboxes, normal buttons, the push buttons, stuff like that. In this particular video, we're going to be focusing on the push button, and then later on we'll take a look at the checkbox and radio button. Radio buttons are a little bit more complicated, and so we have to learn some more stuff in order to understand exactly how those work and how you're supposed to get those to function like you would expect. So, what is a push button then? Well, a push button is the default kind of button in macOS, and that is usually the button that Apple recommends you use most of the time. There previously, in other versions of macOS, there used to be other kinds of buttons, such as recessed buttons, textured buttons, stuff like that, that you could use, that Apple encouraged you to use, but at this point, they don't really encourage it anymore. They encourage you to use the normal push button styling, as well as using images in the normal push button where necessary. So, how do we create a push button? How do we do that? Well, in your viewcontroller.swift file, above view did load, I want you to do the following: var button equals NSButton. And inside of the NSButton initializer, we're going to give it three parameters: title, target, and action. Now, target and action are optional, but we are only going to give action and title values. We're going to leave target as nil. Now, the target can be any view or any object, really. I guess, because because it's the target's type is an optional any. So keep that in mind. Okay, let's go ahead now and say title. I'm going to say click me please as a string, because our title has to be a string. Now, you could also include an image as well if you would like, but I'm not going to include an image. We'll talk about NSImage, which is what you need for an image of a button, later on when we talk about the NSImage view. But for now, we're just gonna have a string of text as our button title. Next, we need our target. So we'll say target. This is going to be nil. Then we need action. Now, our action parameter takes a selector. Now, what is a selector? Well, a selector is a way for Objective-C and our Swift code to talk to one another. Because you see, here's the thing, right, about AppKit. AppKit needed Objective-C originally, right? It was originally built on Objective-C, and so when Swift came along, your Swift code needed to talk to the underlying Objective-C code, and it still does. So that's where selectors come in. A selector is pretty much just a function. We pass it a reference to a method, and so then Objective-C can see that method and run it for you. Now, this can't just be any old method. the method has to be marked with an annotation. And this annotation is at objc. This tells Swift, hey, Objective-C needs to see this method and do something with it. All right, so to create a selector, or pass it a selector, we need to say # selector and we'll say button clicked. All right. All right, let's make sure we did this right. All right, cool. And now we do get an error in Xcode, and it's saying cannot find button clicked in scope. That's because we don't have any method called button clicked. So let's go ahead and create that. So below view did load, we're going to say at objc private func button clicked. Just like that. And so in here, we're going to put something simple. So we're going to print to the console. In a real-world application, you wouldn't print to the console unless you're debugging your code to make sure that everything's functioning properly and logging any errors you might find or anything like that. But in a real-world application, you would, for example, say, save changes to a database, or make a network call, or summon an alert, or open a new window for something. Whatever the case might be, you're going to use that's what you're going to do most of the time with the actions of a button. But we're going to make this simple and just print something to the console. So we'll say print hello world, let's say. Something like that. All right. Let's make sure. All right, we're good. Now, the next thing that we want to do is we need to constrain this button and add it to the view that our view controller contains. Because as it stands right now, our button is just sitting there in space. It does nothing. It's not on screen. None of that, right? So we need to add it to our view. To do this, let's create a separate method to configure our button. And we'll say private func configure button. And then we'll go into view did load. And we will call configure button. Now I want to let you guys know ahead of time that this is not, okay? This is not the recommended way of, like, or at least it's not a proper, well-structured way of doing stuff in your view controller, because ideally things should be split between in the MVC pattern, model view controller, and things shouldn't be done in the view did load method. It's not really the best place for it. But if you're just learning, right? If you're like if you're beginning learning, this is the simplest way to go. And later on, towards the end of the series, I will show you how you can split things up between models, views, and controllers to make things a little bit easier for you. Okay? But for now, stick with me. Okay? Now, in configure button, what we want to do first is we need to enable programmatic constraints for this button. Because by default, I believe by default the value for this particular property is true. but I could be wrong on that. Check the documentation to make sure. But to enable programmatic constraints explicitly, we need to use the translates auto-resizing mask into constraints, and we need to set this to false. That will allow us to specify the constraints manually. If it's true, it will try to translate. It'll try to translate everything else into constraints, and it's not always correct, and that would mean you yourself have to go in and provide a frame to your NSButton to give it X, Y, width, and height values. But with constraints, you don't have to worry about doing that. So we can say button.translates auto-resizing mask into constraints equals false. All right. Now, we're going to be using this property a lot. You're going to see it come up a lot when you're doing programmatic constraints. So it'll get hammered into your head, no worries. All right. Now, if VoiceOver could stop glitching, that'd be great. But I am on the beta, so there are some glitches. So there is some glitchiness. All right. It looks like okay, there we go. Now VoiceOver's cooperating. Okay. The next thing that we need to do is we need to add our button to the view of our view controller. So we can say view.add subview. And this takes in an NSView. So because button is a subclass of NSView, we can just give it button. Just like that. All right. Next, we need to configure the constraints for our button. And to do that, we need to use the activate method of NSLayoutConstraint. This will take in an array of constraints, and it will automatically activate all of them. Now, this didn't used to be the case. We used to have to manually activate each individual constraint, but this makes it a lot easier. It makes your code a lot cleaner. So in here we can say NSLayoutConstraints.activate. All right. Now in here, we need to give it some constraints. And in order to use constraints, we need to understand the concept of anchors. Now, what are anchors? Well, anchors are exactly what they sound like. They're objects that allow you to anchor your views to specific positions in your in the view that they're contained within. There are many kinds of anchors. The most common ones are top, bottom, leading, and trailing anchors. But there are also center X anchor and center Y anchor. You use those in order to help you center your views in its containing view. And if you need an offset, you can define an offset as well, but we're not going to do that. So our layout for this button is going to be something relatively simple. We're going to center it in the view controller's view on the X and Y axes, and then we're going to specify a custom width for our button. So let's go ahead and do that. Inside of our array of constraints, we're going to say button dot, and we want to set a constraint for its center X and center Y anchors. So center X anchor dot constraint equal to view dot center X anchor, and then button dot center Y anchor dot constraint is equal to view dot center Y anchor. All right. So now our button is centered vertically and horizontally in our view. Next, we want to specify the width of the button. You don't have to do this because a button has its own predetermined width and height on its own. And that width and height is automatically calculated based on its text content, and if it has an image, it'll also include that in its calculations as well, right? So you don't have to specify width and height anchors, but we're going to specify a width anchor. And in order to do this, we need to make a similar approach to how we did our center X and center Y anchors. However, instead of just equal to as a parameter, we're going to say equal to constant because we don't want it to be pinned to anything. We just need a specific height or a height or width, depending on which anchor you're using, at a hard-coded value, or maybe it's a calculated value based on certain circumstances and your window size. Right. So to do this, we need to say button dot width anchor dot constraint equal to constant, and we'll say 450. So now our button is going to be 450 pixels wide. At least I believe it's pixels on macOS. I know on iOS it's units. All right. So now we have all of our constraints put in place. We can save our code. And let's run it. All right. So you can see the build succeeded. It's loading our app. Let it kind of do its thing. Let's see. Oh, okay, there we go. And now you can see our button right there in the center of our screen. I'm going to try to move the cursor here so it's out of the way. All right, so there's our button in the center of our window. If we click it and we go into Xcode again, let's see, we want debug area, console. So you can see that we have some other stuff in here as well. And you can see hello world right there. Now let's go ahead and let's say we think something's wrong with our button's width. Well, what we can do is we can also print that information. So let's go ahead and go into our view controller. And instead of printing hello world, we can try to print out specific property values of our button. So we can say button dot frame, maybe, dot width, let's say. So let's try to get the width of our frame whenever we tap the button. Let it run. We can see our build succeeded. Let's click that button. And again, go into our console. And you can see 464.0. Now we set the width of our button to 450. But you can see the frame is the width of the frame is larger than that because of the text content plus any padding. So let's try to increase the number for our width anchor. So if we go into our view controller, button width anchor equal to constant. Let's say instead of 450, we say 500, or even 575 maybe, something like that. Let's try that and see what that looks like. If we run this now, and we run it, so here's our application, there's our button. Let's click that button and see what it says for our frame. And you can see 589.0. So it does, in fact, accept our width for our button. However, because of the padding, it does make it slightly larger. And that's what it did before as well. So that pretty much is how you can configure a basic button without any tint colors or anything like that. But how do we customize maybe its color, right? Maybe you want to customize its color. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. So let's go into our view controller. And we will go into our configure button. Okay. Okay. Yep. All right. Now, if we say button dot, let's say color, and we'll go into our auto completion, and we have bezel color, content tint color, should draw color, and so let's say you're doing this on your own, and you don't know what content tint color is, and you don't know what bezel color is. You don't know the difference. Well, you can go to the documentation. So if we open Safari, I'm gonna open a new window. We'll say NSButton bezel color Apple developer documentation, and here we are, our bezel color. We can read the documentation to see what bezel color is, for example. Now, this says it's the color of the button's bezel. Now, this is available on macOS 10.12, which I believe, I think it's El Capi 10, but I could be wrong on that. Don't quote me. It might even be. I don't think it's Sierra, but you get the idea. So let's go ahead and try bezel color and see what effect it actually has. Right? All right. Not style. Bezel color. There we go. Equals dot and if we see, let's take a look at what type this is. Let's go back to the documentation. Okay, this is an NS color. We'll set it equal to, let's say, a system green. So system green, system gray, whatever the case might be, anything that has system in front of it as a prefix, that will adapt to light and dark mode. There are also other colors that don't have system as a prefix that adapt to light and dark mode. I urge you to read the documentation to figure out which ones do and which ones do not. Because if you want to make sure you support dark mode in your app, that is very important. I'll leave that to you to research on your own. So if we save this and we run our code, let's run that. And now you can see our button is green. We can click the button and all that stuff, and it works just fine. Excuse me. But what about the other color property that we have? And content tint color. Let's go to the documentation and see what that is as well. Now, let's be clear. I know what these do. However, I want you to become familiar with the documentation because you are going to be using the documentation for a great many things. If you do not know how to utilize the documentation, if you do not know how to Google a problem that you're having, you're not going to have a great time. So I want you to become comfortable with it. That is the big thing. All right. So let's go ahead and say NSButton content tint color Apple developer documentation. All right. All right, so here we are. All right. Now this is for macOS 10.14 and above. So if you're not using something that's 10.14 and above at this point, then you might want to upgrade your operating system. But if you can't, then content tint color probably isn't going to be within your reach for now. All right. Now, this is also an NS color. So this is only applicable to buttons that do not have a border. The push button does. So we're not going to worry about this, because it's not going to work for a normal NS button. Now, you could look at some of the other properties of this, of the NS button, to try to figure out, okay, how do I create a borderless button, right? And then you can try this out. However, that's not something I'm going to show you in this video, because I want you, my challenge for you in this video, as I emphasized earlier, is to look at the documentation. Do some Googling. I want you to become comfortable with this process of being able to go into the documentation, or going to Google, Bing, DuckDuckGo, whatever search engine it is that you use, and looking for solutions to your problems that you might have, because you're going to be doing that a lot. And I don't want you guys to get stuck in in tutorial hell. I want you to be able to watch a video, learn a concept, and then go out on your own and practice it. So you don't have to go into a perpetual cycle of watching tutorials or reading tutorials. Right. So really, that pretty much does it for this video, guys. Thank you all so very much for watching, and we'll see you all in the next one.